What's up, Sonic Academy? P-LASK here. And if you think this sounds cool, then you're in the right place right now. Welcome to my course on Ableton Live's vocoder audio effect. In case you didn't know, Live has a fully featured vocoder built right into the software as a stock plugin. And in this course, we're going to break down every single control on the vocoder, talk about carriers and modulators and how they work together. And we'll also look at some practical uses of the vocoder. I'll show you how to pick a good synth sound as an external carrier signal and show you really how you can take any synth sound from any software synth or hardware synth that you own and use it as the carrier signal to create that tone for your vocoder and get that classic kind of talking robot effect, right? Even if you don't have Ableton Live, I think this course is going to be useful to you, as we will be talking basics of vocoders in general. So if you've got another vocoder that you've been having trouble setting up and getting to run, well, hopefully this is going to be helpful for you as well. So stick around. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Super excited. Let's get to it. Hey, what's up, Sonic Academy? Welcome to my How to Use Ableton Live's vocoder course. The live vocoder is something I don't see a lot of coverage on around the interwebs, so I figured it would be a good idea to dive into this thing. It's a pretty full-featured little vocoder. It's got a lot of nice controls, a lot of flexibility. You have a built-in carrier signal. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, we're going to talk about what that means. But you have built-in carrier signals, and you can route any audio in as a carrier signal from any other track inside your project, even routing audio in from hardware synths if you want to, which is really, really cool. Other vocoders I've used in the past have been a little bit of a pain in terms of setup and cabling and things like that. So just having a nice one in the box right here that gets the job done is a very good thing. So in this first video, like we normally do, we will go through and just cover all the different controls and what they're doing here. And then in the next video, we'll look at using it to make a nice vocoded sound. In this first video, though, just so it's not completely dead silent with me talking, I did record a little thing here that I'm going to run the vocoder or run through the vocoder, which is a recording of me saying something in my very deep, very sexy voice. So I had to EQ some of the low end out because it was just so deep. But here's me without the vocoder on. I like vocoders. You like vocoders. If we didn't like vocoders, we'd be lame. Okay, so that's what we're going to be working with. And if I turn the vocoder on, and by the way, the vocoder, if you don't know where to find it, you go to Audio Effects, you'll find it under Reverb and Resonators, I believe. Yes, right here. So I just dragged it onto that I Like Vocoders track. And the way that a vocoder works is it combines two signals together. You have what's called a carrier signal, and you have what's called a modulator signal. And if you're familiar with FM synthesis, you may have heard those terms before. If you're familiar with radio, carriers and modulators, FM and AM, that stuff, you've heard those terms before, carrier and modulator. But the way it works is it takes in the modulator signal, which is usually going to be a voice or a vocal, and it basically breaks it down into frequency bands. It kind of analyzes the whole thing and breaks it down into frequency bands. And then most vocoders are going to have a way to split the bands up, or you can tell it a certain number of bands to have. I should actually reload the default because I think I changed my band count and a few other things. But yeah, you can basically tell it how many frequency bands to analyze. So if I play my voice through this right now, I'm just going to change the carrier mode here to modulator. That means we're essentially just going to hear what my dry vocal sounded like. It's going to sound a little bit different, but what's happening here is it's almost like we're seeing in the EQ. It's breaking it down into its respective frequency bands. And it's taking essentially the entire frequency spectrum and broken it up into 20 bands. And it kind of fits in whatever frequencies it can across the spectrum into those 20 bands. So the fewer amount of bands you're working with, the more kind of gritty and lo-fi things are going to sound. The more bands you have, the more accurate it's going to sound, as it's got a lot more space to kind of analyze each frequency. But it's basically, doing a spectrum analysis of the sound, and it's showing us all the different volumes at different frequencies. And you'll notice here, I have my pencil tool actually switched off, but when I move my mouse over this spectrum analysis area here in the middle of the vocoder, it actually automatically turns into a pencil tool. me go back to 20 bands here, because what I can do is actually use this to kind of turn down or attenuate those different frequencies, almost like you'd be doing with an EQ. So it analyzes the modulator signal, and it uses a carrier signal to sort of imprint its tonality onto that modulator signal. And the common thing you'll hear, like if you've ever heard a vocoder in a song, it sounds like a talking robot or like a singing synthesizer or something like that, like a machine that's singing. Because usually what people will do is they'll run a synthesizer into the carrier input. So the synthesizer, the tonality of that is going to impart itself onto the voice, and you get this sort of combined signal of the different frequencies and the volumes of all those frequencies analyzed as the modulator signal. And then that modulator signal is being used to play back the carrier signal, or essentially tell the carrier signal which frequencies to play at what time, for how long, for how loud. So essentially that's what's going on, this combination of these two signals here. Little fun trivia fact, if you didn't know this, early telephones used vocoders. When you spoke into the receiver of a telephone, your voice would essentially become the modulator. And if I remember my communications courses correctly from college, there was just a carrier tone that was playing. It was like an oscillator tone that was playing kind of silently. You couldn't really hear it, but when you spoke into it, your voice would modulate that carrier signal, and then that's how the voice would be imprinted into an analog signal that would transmit over wires and everything, and then the person on the other end would be able to hear it. So the early telephones were using vocoder technology. So this is pretty old technology. Pretty cool if you look into the history of it. So anyway, let's go through the different controls here. First and foremost, and probably most importantly here, is the carrier section. Because if you don't have a carrier set, you won't hear anything coming from the vocoder. Even if I'm running an audio signal like my voice through it, I won't hear anything unless I have a carrier set. Now, the nice thing about Ableton Live's vocoder is that it's got these built-in carriers, so you'll always hear something coming out of this. Other vocoders I've used in the past don't have this feature, so you might be, putting a vocoder on an audio track and trying to run some audio through it, or talking a microphone through the vocoder, and you're just not hearing anything because there's no carrier signal enabled. So the first one you have on this list is noise. So what that essentially means is there's just this like constant noise oscillator playing under the hood. I can't hear it right now, but when I play my voice, all of these different frequencies and the volumes of these different frequencies of my voice are basically telling that noise oscillator what frequencies to play and where. So it sounds a little dark and evil and, occult ritual, kind of satanic or something. It sounds a little scary right now, but that's what my voice would sound like if my voice box was replaced with a noise oscillator, essentially. You also have the option here to use what's called pitch tracking, and that's going to behave kind of like what I was talking about earlier with early telephones. It would just have sort of an oscillator tone that's just playing constantly. So you can change between a saw wave and then different variations of a pulse wave here. And so let's choose the saw wave, for example. You just have this saw wave playing under the hood, and then when I play my vocal through, remember my vocal is the modulator signal, we hear the tone of that saw wave printed onto my voice. So there's a saw wave playing across the frequency spectrum. This is telling it which frequencies to play for how long and how loud at any given moment. Turn it into more of a square wave tone or different pulse wave tones. You can tell it which frequencies across the spectrum to kind of cut off at. So you have like a low cutoff and a high cutoff. This will go up to 3K, 3 kilohertz, or down to 30 hertz. You can sweep it up to 300 if you just want to remove the low end, essentially, from that oscillator tone. So yeah, basically a low cut and a high cut filter that we can use to determine which frequencies are present in that oscillator tone. And then you have the ability to repitch it. And the whole number values here are approximately semitones. So we got about an octave up that I've just pitched it. So it's got this very kind of like, robotic, Daft Punky, talking robot kind of sound. Okay. And then another option we have here is modulator. This is the one I was using earlier. This is going to use the modulator signal as the carrier signal as well, so it kind of feeds it back into itself. And this doesn't
I
have a
like
really like
vocoders.
super
You
noticeable
like
difference, but it just
vocoders.
creates
We'd
this kind of
like
like
vocoders. We'd be
broken
lame.
down like
I like vocoders.
version of the
You
signal where
like
we've got like
vocoders.
basically the
We'd
sound
like
broken down into these
vocoders.
respective
We'd
frequency
be
bands,
lame.
which we can increase or
I like
decrease.
vocoders. You
And you
like
can kind of use
vocoders.
this almost
We
as
didn't
like
like
a graphic
vocoders.
EQ.
We'd be
That's
lame.
kind of what I've
I
come to
like
use it as, but
vocoders.
I don't
You
really
like
use this if I'm trying to go
vocoders.
for
We
that
didn't like
vocoder sound.
vocoders.
I'm probably not going to use the modulator signal as the carrier signal. I'm probably going to use one of these other ones, but it's kind of an interesting way to run it as a graphic EQ, but it does degrade the sound quality a bit, so just kind of beware. And then the last option here is external. Now, we'll look at that in the next video when we talk about routing this with an external synthesizer and stuff like that and how to get it to sound good. But if I choose that, you can choose audio from one of the other channels in your project and then use that as the incoming carrier signal, which really allows you to customize it and get the type of sound that you want out of it, not just one of these built-in noise or pitch tracking oscillator tones, right? So let's go back to noise just so we can hear something. I know it's terrifying, I'm sorry. Above that, where we can choose the different carriers, we have this enhance button. What that's going to do is basically take all the frequencies that are being analyzed and it kind of normalizes them.
Vocoders, you like vocoders. If we didn't like vocoders, we'd be lame.
So there's a little bit more clarity in the high end in certain contexts. It doesn't always sound good. I know the button enhance just creates this like connotation of, oh, that's going to make it better, right? But it doesn't always sound better. But hey, it's worth turning on and off and just seeing what sounds better to your ears. I think in this context it does sound better, but I was experimenting with it earlier and running some different synth patches through it. It actually sounded better without it on. Okay, now down at the bottom left we have this knob that's labeled unvoiced. What that does is it adds a white noise oscillator tone in addition to the carrier signal. This is determining the volume level of that. And then sensitivity is determining how much of it we hear in the blend compared to just the input signal, which would be the modulator signal, right? Or I'm sorry, the carrier signal, like the carrier signal being the tone that we're hearing. So at 100%, we're hearing pretty much just this unvoiced white noise. I should actually change this to pitch tracking so we can hear a bit of a difference between.
I like vocoders. You like vocoders.
So I'm controlling the volume of the white noise. This is controlling how much of it I'm hearing compared to the pitch tracking, or in this case, the saw wave oscillator. If I turn this down towards 0, I'm just going to hear the saw wave and not the white noise. So you can almost think of this like a crossfader. You can hear that noise kind of creeping in there. And I don't use this a lot. It can tend to sound a little bit messy, but it can help if maybe your carrier signal is lacking some brightness and you need to add a little top end to it. You can increase the volume of this unvoiced noise oscillator or noise signal that'll kind of blend in over the top. I've also noticed with this, though, it doesn't seem like it tracks the incoming pitch when we start using the external input. It doesn't track the incoming pitches as well as just using the external without this noise does. So it's a little bit weird. It's kind of an odd control they've added here, but I just wanted to let you know what it does. It's one of those things that, you know, when I'm using the vocoder, I'll try turning it on. I'll see if it enhances the high end. If, you know, there's maybe not a lot of brightness and I need a little bit more top end hiss into my signal, I'll experiment with it, but it's not always like a go-to, yeah, let's turn this thing on because it's going to make it sound better, okay? This is controlling fast, slow. This is controlling when it cuts between the input signal, the carrier signal, and the noise signal from the unvoiced knob here. This is how quickly it'll do that. So it's one of those things. It's not a massive, like, oh, that makes a massive amount of difference to my sound. It's not going to be super noticeable, but that's what that's doing. Okay, moving on here where we've got our band section. I talked about that. I talked about how we can, let's go back to pitch tracking. I talked about how we can change the number of bands. The fewer bands you have, the more kind of gritty it's going to sound. The more bands you have, the clearer it's going to sound. So you can kind of tell what I'm saying a little bit better with a larger number of bands than you can with a smaller number of bands. It's going to sound a bit more robotic, a bit more like digital 80s, whatever. Again, the default is 20. Range is determining the range of frequencies that are being analyzed by all of these different bands. So you can bring this up to 18K or all the way down to 20 hertz. So now you can almost imagine like I've just got a wider range of the spectrum being analyzed by these 20 bands. So I've got from 20 hertz to 18 kilohertz represented here, but there's that whole range of frequencies is subdivided into 20 bands. I could have a smaller range of frequencies, and now that smaller range of frequencies, let's say 100 to 1000, 1 kilohertz. I can just type 1000 here. Now that smaller range of frequencies, so if we're looking at this spectrum analyzer from 100 to 1000, that's being subdivided into 20 bands. So that's kind of how this range thing is working. So obviously more high end if we increase the range, but each band is going to be a bit wider. Speaking of band width, this BW control over here is going to determine the band width. So it would be nice if it showed this visually, like all these bands getting wider or narrower, but that's essentially what this is doing. As we turn it up, the bands are going to get wider and wider. As we turn it down, the bands get narrower. And you get this more like almost metallic, like flangey, phasey kind of sound. You reset these to their defaults. So 100 is the default. You're going to get a nice even blend, or a nice even width, I should say, for each band. Then this precise versus retro, I don't know exactly what this is doing, but it has to do with how it's treating the bandwidth. As we decrease the bandwidth, you get a much more kind of tinny, almost metallic sound when you're in retro mode. So it depends on the kind of vocoder tone you're going for, I suppose. But in most scenarios, I've found that precise does the trick. Okay, then we have gate. This is interesting because this will set a threshold for the modulator signal. So you can think of the modulator signals coming in at a certain level. If I set this gate at a specific level, let's say -12, that's pretty high, but that only means that volume from my modulator signal that's above -12 will pass through the gate and then trigger these bands in the vocoder. So only kind of like the peaks are triggering the vocoder. If I bring this down, we'll hear more and more. If I bring it up, we'll really only hear the peaky, the loudest words that I'm saying in my performance there, okay? Default setting here is -infinity, meaning any signal that goes above -infinity, any noise whatsoever, is going to trigger the spectrum analysis inside the vocoder. Level is just a very simple output level. We can boost the output gain or attenuate it if it's too loud. Then over here, we've got a few additional controls we'll run through real quick. We've got depth. This is kind of an interesting one. This is going to basically act almost like a dry wet for the natural volume envelopes of your modulator signal. So what I mean by that is if we look at my recording of my voice here, I've got just some natural curves, like certain words I'm saying like very peaky. I have a fast attack time there, and then a little bit of just like natural decay. So as you turn the depth up, it's going to essentially make those envelope shapes or the natural enveloping curve of the audio more narrow. So it's almost like faster attack, faster decay, faster release. As I turn this to the left, it's kind of ignoring the natural volume enveloping or volume shape of the amplitude of the waveform. So we get this more almost constant carrier signal coming in. So it's kind of like an envelope follower, if you've ever used. There is an Ableton envelope follower, Max for Live device. If you've ever used anything like that, you're going to get more sort of sculpting of the volumes of these bands based on the volume of the input modulator signal, or less of that. And then we have attack and release. These will also allow us to reshape some of the natural volume enveloping, but this is more having to do with the output of the signal. So if I want each of the bands to fade in as the modulator sort of triggers them, I can have it fade in and things won't get quite as loud quite as quickly, or I can turn the release time up and all the bands will sort of hang out for a bit longer. Once we put this into practice, you'll hear what I'm talking about. We'll look at how this can be practical and actually help increase or decrease clarity in the vocals that you're playing through your vocoder if you want that. And then the last couple controls here, we can set the output so it just outputs in mono, stereo, or LR mode, which is going to split the two channels. Then we have this formant control. This is kind of an interesting one, which sort of shifts all these frequencies either up if we turn it to the right or down if we turn it to the left. When you shift it up to the right, you get a little bit more of like a feminine or childlike vocal quality. When you shift it to the left, you get like a deeper, like more masculine, dark kind of a tone. And then finally, of course, we have a dry wet, which allows us to blend the vocoded signal with the original dry signal.
We didn't like vocoders.
Set it back to default stereo, set it back to dry wet at 100. And that covers all the controls in the vocoder, and I thank you for bearing with me and listening to that 100,000 times. But in the next video, we'll actually make this into something that sounds nice and add it in with some music, and I will catch you guys in that one. Okay, welcome to part 2. In this one, we're going to take the vocoder and actually use it to make something that sounds nice with the musical accompaniment that I've got going on here. So let me play you what I got. I got a little Craig David, MJ Cole style UKG R&B sort of groove here. And what I've done is I've basically taken the chords that I'm using for this E-piano, this keys sound, and I've copied them over here onto another MIDI track that I've called Vocoder Carrier. I've also extended the chords out. You can see here I've got some performance things going on where it plays the chord and arpeggiates and does some stuff. But I just basically took the three main chords and just sustained those out into just, you know, their full long form chords here. And then we've got a synth here on this Vocoder Carrier. I'm just using one of Ableton's synths called Wavetable. And I've got this pretty straightforward kind of super saw-ish patch. I'll show you guys in a second. But we're going to use that as the Vocoder Carrier. Now, before we do that, though, let's just reload the default vocoder. So I'm going to hit hot swap here. We'll load the default in. And let's just make sure that my vocal sounds okay here. There's that noise carrier again. And with the noise and the pitch tracking, we hear this kind of fun robotic voice thing, but we can't really pitch it and make it sound well. With the pitch tracking, we can adjust the pitch from here, but I can't really make it sound harmonically pleasing with the notes and things that I'm playing in the other parts of the music, the other elements of the music. So that's where using the external carrier can come into play here, because you can tune it based on MIDI notes that you're playing on your synthesizer, and B, you can just get it to sound a whole lot nicer because you can pretty much run any sound into this as your carrier signal. So we're going to get like the tonal quality of a synth sound, and the notes playing off of that synth sound, we're going to use those as the carrier, and it's going to make the voice sound a lot nicer and fit in with the music as well. So I'm going to set the carrier to external, and we're going to route it in from my Vocoder Carrier track. So let's do that right now. And also, let me just play you what I've got on the Vocoder Carrier track. I'm going to solo it and just play the chords back. Pretty straightforward, super saw kind of a sound. It's a little loud. Let me turn it down. Now, the reason I chose this type of sound, you can use any synth patch that you want to, but generally speaking, you're going to want to choose something that's very bright and has a lot of harmonics. Otherwise, the vocoder isn't going to have enough frequency content to analyze to really make the vocal sound clear. So again, you probably don't want to use a sub bass for your vocoder carrier signal. You want something that's very bright, that has a lot of harmonics. Super saws tend to work really well for this. So that's what I chose here with the Wavetable synth. So again, this is the sound we're going to be using. Okay, So let me stop playback here. Let's go back to my vocoder track, or my track with my vocal on it, where I have the vocoder. And we've got external carrier, vocoder carrier, that track vocoder carrier running as the input. And then you can tell it to receive that signal either pre-FX, post-FX, or post-mixer. Now, I don't have any effects after wavetable. I just have wavetable just kind of chilling on its own track. So if I did have effects after that, let's say, we'll just throw something on for the sake of example. Yeah, let's just throw a reverb on. If I did have an effect on that track, what these routing options mean, pre-FX means it's going to tap the signal here or pick that signal up before it hits the reverb. Post-FX is going to pick up the signal after it goes through the reverb. So we're going to get like the full sound, including the reverb. And then post-mixer means it's going to pick up the signal after it hits the reverb, but it's also going to factor in the fader level that I set here. So you see I turned this down a little bit. It's going to factor that in as well. If I chose post-FX and not post-mixer, it ignores my fader level on my mixer, and it's just picking up the signal full volume right after it goes through the reverb here, or whatever other effects I have on the channel. Now, I didn't have any effects. I'm going to delete that reverb. I think this sounds okay on its own, so it really doesn't matter which option I pick here. The only difference is if I did choose post-mixer, it's going to bring the signal in slightly attenuated because I turned this down. So let's just do post-FX for right now. That's fine. Okay, so if I play my vocal back, I should hear the vocoder, right? I should hear something. Well, I got this soloed. Let's try unsoloing that. I hear my drums, I hear my keys. I don't hear my vocal. I see it's going into the vocoder. It's being picked up as the modulator signal, but I don't hear anything. Well, the reason for that is because my carrier signal is not playing anything right now. So this is super important. To hear the vocoder active when you're using the external carrier, you need to make sure both the modulator and the carrier signal are playing at the same time. So if I go over here to my vocoder carrier track, and let's make sure my MIDI is coming in here, and I turn the record arm on. Whoops, I don't want to add a new return track. I just want to turn the record arm on, and then I let things play here. Again, my vocal loop is playing, but we're not hearing it. But if I start hitting some notes, so I'm just kind of playing one note at a time on my keyboard, and that one note is sending the synth sound into the carrier input on the vocoder, and I can hear things, right? But it's going to sound a lot better if I play my chords in, right? So let's go here and just play this chord clip. Let me stop all the other music just so we can focus on what the vocoder's doing.
I like vocoders.
Now it's a bit loud. I apologize for that. We're getting a little bit of clipping, so let's turn things down a bit.
I like vocoders.
Or the other option is we can go into the vocoder itself and turn the output level down. Let's maybe turn that down by at least 6. Then we can keep our track volume up. Let's go maybe a little lower.
I like vocoders. You like vocoders. If we didn't like vocoders, we'd be lame.
So now, even though I was just talk singing, it sounds like through the vocoder and through the playback of the notes from the carrier signal, it sounds like a nice musical, harmonically pleasing chord that's going to match nicely with the chords from my keys patch here and then from my drums, with my drums. Let's hear it all together. Now let's try a couple of things just to clean the signal up a little bit, maybe make it sound a little nicer. We could perhaps try increasing the number of bands. Maybe we'll go all the way up to 40. Let's play around with the depth here. Remember, that has to do with the envelope following. It's going to be a little bit more peaky and transient if I turn the depth up. If I turn this down, it's not paying as close attention to the dynamics of this, and it's just sort of feeding the synth signal in a little more constantly. Just a little less depth. Let's play around with the tonality with the bandwidth controls. Remember, if we narrow the bands, now, with a more narrow bandwidth, I am starting to notice I'm not hearing as much of the quality, like, you know, the tonality or the intervals in the chords as clearly. So we'll keep the bandwidth around the middle. Just wanted to test that out. Let's try the attack and release. Remember, this is going to take the volume of all the bands and fade them in more gradually. I might want to smooth them out a little bit, but not too much. But let's try turning the release up. So we get more of the sustaining from the Vocoder Carrier synth. I kind of like that. More of the kind of release time, I should say, from that. So the sound sustains a little bit longer, but we can still hear what the lyrics are. We can try using the formant. Change almost like the gender quality of the voice, make it more feminine or more masculine. I like that, somewhere in there. Could even try adjusting the dry wet, maybe blend a little of my lame talking in there. No, that's lame. Keep it at 100. And we could add, I got these pizzicato strings. Let's keep the vocal up. Maybe turn the chords down a little from the keys. Let's get a nice blend. But that sounded pretty good. Now, one last thing I want to point out that is very important here is notice how the Vocoder Carrier track, I have this track muted. Even though it's muted, it's still feeding in as the carrier signal into the vocoder, and I'm still hearing it in the context of how it's blending with my modulator signal in the vocoder. But if I had this track unmuted, I would hear the original synth sound just kind of blaring over everything, and I would kind of lose what I'm getting from the vocoder. So I just get this loud synth kind of drowning out the vocoder. So in most cases, if you're just using a synth as the carrier input and you don't want to hear it, just mute the channel, but make sure you have all the routing configured here from the vocoder. I'm going to call this the vocoder track. I'm going to put this out. I'm going to hit up MJ Cole and see what he thinks. Maybe he'll do a remix. But yeah, anyway, that is vocoders. I hope that makes sense. I hope you've learned something that maybe you didn't know about the vocoder before. And as you can see, it's, you know, pretty straightforward, pretty easy to use. You just drag and drop it in and you'll hear something at least. But obviously you get a lot more mileage and a lot more, I think, tonal precision out of it when you use the external carrier and just route your own synths in. If you're using a hardware synth, keep in mind you can run a hardware synth into an audio channel and then set that audio channel as your audio from here, and, you know, just get a plethora of different tones to use as your carrier and, you know, run your voice through it. And, you know, I've only been running vocals through this, but of course try running drums, try running bass loops, try running synth loops, guitars, try all different instruments and all different elements as the modulator signal, and just see what kind of results you get. Anyway, again, hope it's been helpful. Really look forward to seeing you guys again in another Sonic Academy tutorial very soon.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate all the support from you guys. If you love this video, then smash a like, and if you want to be notified about new videos, hit the subscribe and notification buttons. Peace!